These three mistakes caused me to gain weight and feel terrible on keto. So today we're going to talk about how you can avoid them and strategies that you can implement to make sure that you don't feel the same way that I did. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel where we break down complex science and health information so you don't have to. And if you love what you hear today, please consider subscribing to the channel. One of the biggest topics I often get asked about are mistakes on keto, because there's a lot of people who are either starting keto brand new, or they've been on keto or on and off over the last year or two, and they really want to get started with the right foundation. And that is exactly the key. You have to start with the right foundation. And if you're like me, you didn't start with the right foundation. So I want to tell you all the mistakes that I made early on and what you can do to avoid them and how you can get started with the right foundation, right? Because it's just like a house or an apartment building or anything. If you have a terrible foundation, inevitably that house or that building will come crashing down. And that's when you have your binges or you actually gain a lot more weight than you even started with. And that's exactly what we want to avoid. So in order to avoid that, we have to have the right foundation. So let's talk about what I did so that way you can avoid it. 10 years ago is when I started my keto journey. Back then, keto was not the cool kid on the block, and there was very few resources, information, or even videos talking about how to properly do a ketogenic diet. Instead, it was just known that a ketogenic diet helped people with epilepsy, and there were some new studies looking at oxygen toxicity seizures from my good friend Dr. Dom D'Agostino and how it helped all of these soldiers avoid these toxicity seizures, which was awesome. So Dr. Jacob Wilson, my business partner, and I decided to say, you know what, let's try this ketogenic diet for ourselves and be the first ones to kind of study what effect keto has on body composition. And like we do with every study that we do as scientists, the only thing that you should be doing first is testing everything on yourself before you put anyone else through it. So that's exactly what we did. And so all we knew was a ketogenic diet was this high fat, moderate protein, super low carb diet. Really had no idea what foods to eat. There were very few food options or even keto snacks at the time. And so our meals consisted of the very, very, very basic, yet very delicious, what I call my protein keto mousse. And so for 3 meals a day, I ate this keto mousse recipe, which was, again, delicious, but it consisted of heavy cream, protein powder, unsweetened cocoa powder, a little bit of sugar-free sweetener, and it had a little bit of coconut oil and coconut manna in it. So that way when you put it in the fridge, it hardened up a little bit and it was like this delicious keto mousse. So I made a lot of mistakes. A lot of you are watching this like, that sounds great, but I ate that 3 times a day. I was definitely in ketosis. My ketones were through the roof. The problem is my calories were like 95% fat. I was eating a ton of calories because think about how much heavy cream I had 3 times a day. And on top of that, I didn't eat a well-formulated ketogenic diet. I was eating just a ton of fat, a moderate amount of protein, had very few other supplements that we'll talk about inside of my diet, and I felt horrible. I actually gained weight. I went through the keto flu like over and over and over again. But after about a month, I looked at Jacob, I said, this is the worst thing ever. I'm never doing this again. And so today I want to talk about what are some of the things that happened during that journey and how you can avoid them. The first one I want to talk about is actually contrary to what most people believe, and it's actually too much fat, right? There's some people out there, and you might be watching this saying, oh, I don't get enough fat. If you're like me, I actually had too much fat. I was just putting heavy cream and everything, and a lot of people who are just getting started on keto will go to Starbucks, or they'll go to Dunkin' Donuts, or they'll even make coffee at home, and they'll put a ton of heavy cream to start their day. And they're wondering why their progress is stalled or they're not able to lose weight. And what they don't realize is, yes, fat is your friend on a ketogenic diet, but too much fat can also be your enemy because that fat has a lot of calories. And when you're putting tablespoon after tablespoon after tablespoon, or in my case, cups of heavy cream inside of what you're consuming, whether that's a coffee or my keto mousse, that is a ton of calories. So some of you unknowingly are having 500 to 1,000 calories just to start your day with your coffee, and then you go into your meals for the rest of the day, and that's likely what's stalling your progress. So be careful of how much fat you have early on. You definitely want to make sure you're having enough, but make sure you're not eating 80-90% of your calories as fat, and you can find that in sneaky ways of like, you really don't need to put butter in your coffee. You don't need to have keto mousse every single day, let alone 3 meals a day. So that's a way to avoid this mistake of hitting plateaus and not reaching your goals. One of the best ways, and I'll link it down below in the description, that you can find out exactly how much fat you should be consuming is look at our keto calculator on ketogenic.com. It takes the guesswork out of it. You put in all of your information of how often you work out, if any, what's your goals, and it'll actually spit out exactly how many calories and your fat, your protein, your carbohydrate intake, and even net carbohydrates that you probably want to be consuming in order to hit those goals. So I wish we had that back then, but fortunately for each and every one of you, you have that resource available to you now. So that's number one. The number one mistake was too much fat. The number two mistake is something that doesn't get talked about enough, and that is actually too little protein, right? Protein is our friend. A lot of times we were worried about, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have too much protein. It's gonna spill over and act like cake and candy inside of my body. It's just gonna get stored as glucose. That does not happen in anyone on a ketogenic diet, unless you're probably having 500, 600, 700 grams of protein, and that's very difficult to do unless you're going to a Brazilian steakhouse every single day. So that being said, do not fear protein. In fact, tend to err on the side of eating more protein, not less. And so a lot of times we often, if we're intermittent fasting and people are only having 15 to 25 grams of protein per meal, you wonder, you're like, how am I supposed to get all of that protein? How do I know how much protein to eat? Well, go back to that keto calculator and that'll kind of spit things out. But a general rule of thumb that I recommend for people is at minimum 1 gram per pound of body weight. Or you can go per pound of ideal body weight if you're trying to lose weight, but that's a minimum. Again, it's very difficult to store protein as fat. A lot of people don't understand that concept. Protein is very thermogenic in nature, meaning it gets burned and it does not get stored very easily. And so I would really recommend the 1 gram per pound of body weight to start. And you're starting to do the math in your head. You're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of protein. How do I do that? You're gonna need to eat higher quality sources of protein and probably bigger amounts. And by doing so, that'll also contribute to this process known as satiety, which is also like how full we feel. Inevitably eating you to eat less calories, which would have avoided my problem. Again, I was only having 1 scoop of protein with my keto mousse. Obviously, that's a very big problem. So highly recommend that 1 gram per pound of body weight or per ideal body weight. For me, that's about 180 grams per day. That is when I operate at my best, right? And so yes, you're not gonna hit that every day, but here's another general rule of thumb, is at minimum, you want at least 25 to 35 grams per meal. There is a process known as muscle protein synthesis that really only gets triggered when you have a high quality source of protein at that 25 to 35 grams per meal. And that's a minimum, right? You can have 40 or 50 grams per meal. If you're having 2 or 3 meals a day, you're probably gonna wanna err up on that 40, 50 grams. If you're throwing in a shake or a snack, obviously you can supplement with protein to build into that. But again, that 25 to 35 grams per meal is really where you turn on this light switch known as muscle protein synthesis, which helps keep you lean, but also building muscle. And the last one that I'm going to talk about is electrolytes. Electrolytes. So early on, think about what I told you about what I was eating, right? I had heavy cream, protein, unsweetened cocoa powder. I had no electrolytes inside of that. I was not getting very little sodium, very little magnesium, very little potassium with that keto mousse 3 times a day. It's the #1 contributor to this process known as the keto flu. So we've talked before on this channel about what the keto flu, but as a quick summary, the keto flu is basically when your body's adapting to primarily using ketones and fat as fuel, your glucose and insulin levels are starting to get lower and lower. And when that happens, your body tends to excrete out a lot of electrolytes. When it excretes out a lot of electrolytes, like with your urine, you need to supplement those back in. If not, that's when you get headaches, you're tired, you're fatigued, which are often symptoms of what we call keto flu or this keto adaptation process. Supplementing with electrolytes, making sure you're salting your foods, making sure you're eating foods high in potassium like the amazing avocado, or even just supplementing with electrolytes in general is very beneficial, and I highly recommend it when first starting out on your keto journey to help you get over that hump and avoid the keto flu. And I have an asterisk here because I think there's one more that applies to most people today. And I wanted to touch on this one because these were the 3 that I had back when I started keto over 10 years ago. But there's one that I see that is the most prevalent today, and that is because of what we have available to us today. The things that we have available to us today, I didn't have 10 years ago. And that mistake is too many keto snacks. I feel like there's so many now, right? Which is great. I love that. I'm super happy about it. I consume keto snacks, but very early on in people's journey, I know people who are just constant snackers all day long, right? And so they're having these things, some of which are labeled keto, which aren't keto. And we've talked about that before on this channel as well, about how to decipher between what's legitimately keto and what's not. But a lot of people are consuming keto bars and keto chips and keto this early on in their journey, and it's causing them to plateau or stall out, right? You have to understand early on, especially when first adapting to keto, you want to get through that adaptation phase. And while keto snacks can be beneficial in the long term to help compliance and adherence to stay on the diet, early on it can cause some disruptions to that keto adaptation process. So in the beginning, avoid too many keto snacks. You don't need to be having you don't need to run to the grocery store and go buy every single thing that's labeled keto. Stick with the basics, right? Do some intermittent fasting, focus on 2 to 3 high quality meals a day, maybe one snack here and there that's like an avocado with some salt on it, or maybe even a little bit of jerky or a little bit of liver would be even better. But so try those things out instead of focusing on keto snacks, because those oftentimes not only can spike your glucose, because some of them that are labeled keto have things like sugar in them or hidden sources of sugar or non-caloric sweeteners that actually can spike your glucose, but they also cause you to be hungrier over time because they're kind of riding you through that wave and not allowing you to focus on keeping the main thing, which is high quality nutrition, focusing on meals, focusing on a little bit of intermittent fasting, and of course, some movement. So those are my top 3 keto mistakes. Those are the ones that I had in my journey. And I would love to know in the comments, what are some of the mistakes, if you've been on a ketogenic diet, what are some of the mistakes that you've made before in your past? Share them down below, because I think there's a lot of people that'll see this that will want to know other ones as well, but also ask questions that you want to see us cover on this channel in terms of either keto mistakes or anything keto related or health, nutrition, or wellness. So appreciate you, and I'll talk to you soon.